Florida-Miami might be my favorite non-conference game of the year. Who needs it more?
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Benson McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your daily source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth: realignment, coaching carousel, the portal, and so much more. Getting you ready for the season, we've always got you covered. This episode brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. What's the most important game for Tennessee? And did you see what the Mountain West did? That's all coming up later on the show. But this game is just hot and spicy. Not just because, look, if you are a non-Florida Miami fan, or frankly, if you are, and you would like some enjoyable entertainment to just kill some time, maybe you're sitting in an airport right now, go to the last video I did talking about Florida and Miami and just scroll through the comment section. It's a good time. It's a good time. I don't have a dog in the fight. Personally, I haven't made a pick on that game yet. The last betting line movement was in favor of Florida, who's at home, about a 2.5-point underdog to the Hurricanes. And speaking of those particular teams, here's why Florida needs a win more than Miami. Florida goes into 2024 with, per all the metrics and per anyone that knows anything about college football, I'll just barely include myself in that mix. They have the hardest schedule in the country. Miami at home. Texas A&M 2 weeks later. At Mississippi State. Well, that shouldn't be that hard. Host UCF, not a cakewalk. At Tennessee. Host Kentucky. Play Georgia and Jacksonville. At Texas. LSU. Ole Miss. At Florida State. I mean, give me a break. They're playing two of the top three odds teams in the ACC. And they are not an ACC team. There's nobody else that is doing that in the non-conference. It doesn't work out particularly well. So that week one game, there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of juice. It is a spicy matchup. You've got a couple of third-year head coaches with varying levels of expectations. Miami's are certainly much higher going into this season. I don't think either coach, barring a complete and abject disaster, winds up fired after this year. I don't even know if Cristobal would get that, but Napier, if he goes 2-10, okay, he might be shown the door, but barring something like that, which I don't expect, both these guys are going to survive this season. The question in this game is what sort of pressure gets applied for 2025. And the answer is Florida, because as for who needs it more, because they just don't have as many opportunities to win games. We don't have betting lines for all of these other matchups for Florida yet, but hosting Texas A&M, they're probably a slight dog at home, as they are against Miami. They'll be favored against Mississippi State and UCF. At Tennessee, underdog. Georgia, underdog. At Texas, underdog. LSU at home, underdog. Ole Miss, underdog, even though it's at home. At Florida State, most definitely an underdog in Tallahassee. So the opportunities for Billy Napier to secure wins that help him keep his job and keep the pressure at bay that could start to surround and really close down on his program, like the training walls in Tales of the Empire with Barris and the person that she's fighting, or the walls keep closing in. That's kind of what it feels. If anybody who gets that reference, shoot me a message so I can give you a virtual high five. But the walls kind of keep closing in. They're okay right now. They really are. Should they be? Not in my view, but they are. That's the reality of the situation. So they can start to close in if you only deliver 3 or 4 wins this year. But if you get to 5 or if you get to 6, Billy Napier's doing just fine. And everybody will recognize that. Conversely, this is a game Miami should win. They're a slight road favorite. They're still a road favorite. I think Miami's had the better offseason overall. They've certainly had the louder and probably the more expensive offseason. This has an all-in sort of feel for Miami with the way they have gotten the last year of Cam Ward's college career, probably the last year of Damian Martinez's career coming from Oregon State. That was not a cheap acquisition when you're looking at what the NIL valuation of those two guys were. And you look at the rest of their roster and the way they have recruited, they've got bigger expectations there. But for Miami, if they go into Gainesville and lose this game, they have plenty of chances to save their season and get to where they expect to be, contending for an ACC championship. And that game, it'll affect their playoff hopes, But I think Miami fans, at least the ones I have interacted with and spoken to, guys like Alex Dono, think that pushing for an ACC title and a playoff spot is a successful season. Take that next step forward, win high single digits. It was 7 last year. Can you get above that? Can you get 8? Can you get 9? Like if Miami goes 9-3, that's taken another step in a positive direction. Then you can go into 2025 and say, okay, this has to be a 10-win year. But they've got a schedule that it is workable. It is certainly not the hardest, but is it a cakewalk? No, I don't think so. At Louisville, Florida State, don't sleep on at Syracuse last week of the regular season. They've got to go all the way across the country and play Cal. Stuff can get wild. But certainly Miami's a team that should be able to win at least 8 games this year. But winning at Florida is not going to be determinative of whether or not they do that. It's not the solely impactful game when I look at their schedule. Because Mario Cristobal's team starts at Florida. Let's say they lose that game. Their next 3 games should all be easy wins. Florida A&M, Ball State, at USF. Now USF is going to be a solid team in the American. Should not lose that football game. Shouldn't, if you pull a Middle Tennessee, then there can be problems as the season progresses. But they should be comfortably at least 3-1, if not 4-0, before they play Virginia Tech, who come into Hard Rock Stadium. And look, just don't forget that Virginia Tech is a good football team. One of the leaders in the country in returning production. They've got their head coach back. They have got their quarterback back. If Kyron Jones can just be a capable passer, he is a dynamic runner of the football. So then they go at Cal bye week before they take on Louisville and Florida State. Then after those 2 tough games, you got Duke, you've got Georgia Tech, revenge game, dare I say, Wake Forest and Syracuse. There are just so many more winnable games. So I look at these 2 schedules and say, boy, if Florida doesn't win that game, 4 wins feels entirely possible. Entirely possible. They might not win a game the second half of the year. Georgia, Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, Florida State. That could be 5 straight losses. If Miami is your 6th loss, where are you getting 6 wins? I mean, you can win some of these games, but you're not going to win that many of them. It's just a really, it is a brutal, brutal situation for Billy Napier and company to be in. And I think Miami's schedule in the ACC is more favorable. And yeah, you can say, well, if Florida had that schedule, they'd win more games. Probably true. That's probably true. But they're not. And at some point, the record does kind of sit with fans. Like whatever happens, this is why college football is great. Whatever happens in a college football game, fans just have to sit with that for a week. And sure, you can think about the context of the opponent, but they look at the record more. They look at the record, and in Florida, if they start 0-1 and then they beat Samford, which they will, and then they lose to Texas A&M, suddenly they have to sit there and stare at 1-2. And Miami can't go 1-2. Not when their next 2 opponents are Florida A&M, Ball State, and at South Florida. So they're guaranteed to at least have their fans feeling better and more optimistic about what the season is going to entail. And that's why that game, and it's in Gainesville, is so big for Billy Napier and the Gators. Certainly it is going to be wildly fun. I can't wait for that game. Cannot wait. August 31st. That's like 1 month and 27 days. That's just not that far away. 3:30 Eastern on ABC. Gosh, is that ever going to be just so much fun. I can't wait. Someone's going to win that game. This isn't European soccer. Someone's going to win that game, and somebody's going to lose. It's got to happen. Just think about it. If you're a Miami or a Florida fan, how are you going to be feeling? Miami's got more hope. Florida, very much less so. Tennessee's got plenty of hope because Tennessee should be a good football team this year. What game do they have to win to ensure they're an SEC and playoff contender? We'll talk about that next. Before we get to the Vols, let's get to Game Time. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier, which are both good for you. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. Also good for you. They've got killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets. You can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, whatever you are looking for. You get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. So once you get there, you know exactly what you're going to be looking at. Take the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE. That's Locked On College, all one word, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. What is the most important game, not the biggest, the most important game for Tennessee this year? That's Eric Cain, Locked On Vols, joining me to discuss. When I think about Tennessee's SEC championship and playoff hopes, Eric, you got to be in the 10-win range in the regular season. I don't think 9-3 puts you out of the playoff discussion in the SEC. I also don't think it is a lock that 9-3 gets you in. I think it is more likely than not 9-3 misses the playoff, even with an SEC or Big Ten schedule. So, if you're thinking about Tennessee going 10-2, I'm penciling in, I'm really writing in pen that at Georgia is going to be a loss because I'm not going to pick anybody to win in Athens this year. So I look at the games at home against Alabama and at Oklahoma. You do a coin flip on which of those games is the most important one for Tennessee this year. What do you think?
Yeah, like I want to say, it's funny, I was kind of talking with a colleague about this earlier today, and we were kind of debating back and forth. Like, Tennessee likely could be favored at home against Alabama, depending on, what happens up to that point. Tennessee on the road at Oklahoma, I could see Tennessee being a dog, right? Because it's the first SEC game, it's on the road, all that type of stuff. But I truly think, I hate to do coach speak here, but I mean, Oklahoma comes first. Oklahoma's the first game on the SEC schedule. It's the first true road game of the season, the first true road game of Nico Iamaleava, quarterback's career. That's a huge game for Tennessee. And I think when you look at the rosters, I mean, I haven't done my deep dive into Oklahoma just yet, but when you look at the rosters, I like Tennessee's roster better than Oklahoma. I like Tennessee's quarterback better than Oklahoma. I understand Oklahoma's got some shuffling on the offensive line where, Tennessee's added one, but it's a real good one in Lance Hurd from LSU. I think Tennessee's more grouped and composed compared to Oklahoma, if that makes sense. But I think that's a huge game. I mean, put aside the storylines of Josh Heupel going back home, Bob Stoops, all that type of stuff. I mean, the national media is going to be, hitting us over the face with that all summer long and leading up to that game. I just think that's a huge game because it leads you right into the off week for Tennessee, the first one. Then you go back on the road at Arkansas. Say you struggle at Oklahoma. I mean, Arkansas is not a good football team, but, I mean, Tennessee needs to win that game as well. So I think simply because it comes first, it will set the tone for what's another, daunting SEC schedule for Alabama at home the third Saturday in October, for Florida the week before that, and other big games against Kentucky, and then, of course, Georgia later on. So I'll say Oklahoma, though I still think Alabama is going to have a great roster. I still think Alabama's got a good quarterback, and that's going to be a very challenging game.
Yeah, and I hear you on the first one. I think I lean Alabama here, and allow me to explain why. If you go into that Oklahoma game at 3-0, which they should, like the honorable mention games here for most important that we'll talk about in a little bit are the NC State, which is essentially a road game, but not technically, and then Florida, just because it's a massive rivalry, and Florida's not a great team, but they're also not a bad football team per se, as Tennessee learned a season ago. I think that when you have Oklahoma earlier in the year, if you lose that game, then the Alabama game is, the importance of that becomes magnified. But if you win that game against Oklahoma, I still think Alabama is the more important of the two, because then you have a chance to be undefeated before you go and play at Georgia on November 16th, because the games sandwiched in between there are Kentucky at home and Mississippi State also at home. So it'll have been a minute since they've played a road game, because they have 4 straight SEC home games, which is bizarre, but it's certainly a break for Tennessee schedule-wise. So I think regardless of the outcome of that Oklahoma game, their playoff and SEC title hopes are alive. But I think the stakes, certainly if you lose that Oklahoma game, of the Alabama game are heightened, because then you have Georgia on the schedule. But I also think that if you win that Oklahoma game, the ceiling on what Tennessee can accomplish this year, everybody's got to remember, their win total is 9.5. It's the second highest in all of college football. There are big expectations for the Vols this year, even with a new quarterback that they're working in Nico Iamaleava, who certainly looked good in the bowl game trouncing of Iowa last year. That's why I think I lean Alabama. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, those are good points. And, to be a good, guy on the debate team, which I was not. I was not on the debate team, but you got to be able to argue both sides of the coin. So I hear what you're saying, and I think home and away comes into a big focus here when we're talking about if you're on that fringe of the college football playoffs. Say Tennessee has a road win at Oklahoma. If Jackson Arnold, that's early in the season, say Jackson Arnold turns it around or starts to evolve into who we think he's going to be, and it's like, man, that win looks really good for Tennessee, and on the road as well. And say you lose that Alabama game at home, that's when you can really point to and say, well, that's a big win for Tennessee, who may finish at 9-3 or 10-2. But you're right, you win that game and you go into a huge rivalry game, third Saturday in October. Say you take care of Florida, and we'll speak on in a moment. You don't want to lose that game at home because you'll be favored. You potentially could be undefeated. And this is kind of a new era of Alabama football. Still, I think that roster is good. Jalen Milroe's going to be one of the best players in the country.
Kalen DeBoer is very good.
Yeah. I mean, he's being knocked before he even comes to the SEC. All you can do is coach where you are, and he's done a great job so far. We'll see how it translates, but at least that roster in 2024 is still going to be really, really good. So I can see both sides of it for sure. I just think that that could be a marquee win that you pick up earlier in the year that can be kind of a saving grace for you, but also just it's a tone setter, because if you go on the road and handle business against Oklahoma, you should have no issue with Arkansas on the road. You should have no issue with Florida at home, and you should give Alabama, everything they can handle at Neyland Stadium.
Let's hit the honorable mention candidates that I talked about. Florida at home. That one isn't, potentially a most important game because of the national ramifications, but more about the personal ramifications. It's Tennessee, Florida. Like that game at home, you can't have a stumble there. It's one thing if you stumble at home against Kentucky, and that wouldn't be great for the Vols with the expectations and potential they have going into the season. But that Florida game's one. But that second week game, I think one of the more under the radar non-conference matchups, NC State and Tennessee. You can highlight Oklahoma as the most important game on the schedule, and I hear that. Or you can highlight Alabama. Tennessee is not going to, nor should they, nor can they afford to overlook NC State. That is a good football team.
Yeah, no doubt. It got better, significantly better at quarterback in this offseason. We know that with Grace McCall. They finished last year hot. They did pretty well in the transfer portal.
Very well.
All things considered. Yeah, that's a big-time game. And for sure, Tennessee can't afford to overlook that. It's away from Neyland Stadium, but it's not a true road game. And Tennessee fans will travel, and it'll be great. But I do like Tennessee's makeup so much more. I like Tennessee's roster so much more. But that's not a gimme. And I mean, Tennessee will be favored in that game, I would imagine, but it's not going to be any more than 6, probably somewhere around there.
I would frankly be surprised if it's even that high. I bet you it's closer to 3 or 4.
Yeah, and I mean that's going to be a big time game. And this is where you get in trouble as fans and media alike. We assume, we assume that's going to be a win. You can't assume. You got to go play that game. But that is a huge game. And depending on how Tennessee plays in that game and how Nico looks, and again, not a true road game, but how do you handle the environment? I mean, athletes, regardless of sports, are all about routine, and how do you handle the not in the hotel before the morning break, all that type of stuff. It's a big opportunity for Tennessee. How you perform in that game obviously is going to be detrimental in terms of how you're going to perform a couple weeks later at Oklahoma. The Florida game at home, as you said, I mean, it's Tennessee, Florida. And from the outside looking in, it's a huge rivalry game and everything, but you'd be shocked if I told you that since 2004, Tennessee only has 2 wins against Florida. Last year, Florida was not good. Tennessee lost that game because Tennessee loses so many games to Florida that Tennessee shouldn't over the years. Florida, again, Billy Napier's coaching for his life. I think that Florida's much better at the quarterback position than anybody will give him credit for with Graham Mertz. They've got some pieces. Again, like you said, they're not a bad team. They're going to be in desperation mode, but it's going to be at home. The last time these two teams played at Neyland Stadium, Tennessee won, albeit Tennessee tried to give it away and only won by like 4 points at 34-38 after leading 38-21 with a couple minutes left. But that's going to be a huge game simply because history is not on Tennessee's side as it never is. But I mean, Tennessee should handle Florida if you have any hopes of being a college football playoff team for sure. And then, of course, you mentioned Kentucky, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on that. What Florida is to Tennessee is what Tennessee's been to Kentucky. Tennessee's own Kentucky. There's only like 2 or 3 wins dating back to like 1984 that Kentucky owns over Tennessee. So, couple big time games at home at Neyland Stadium that they've got to handle. But again, if you're a college football playoff caliber team, you should handle those teams. You should have no issue with those teams, but as we know, there's nothing guaranteed in the SEC.
Absolutely not. Eric Cain, Locked On Vols. He's always guaranteed to give us a good segment as usual. Eric, thanks for stopping by.
Thanks, Spencer.
Did you guys see what the Mountain West did? I did, and if you didn't, you should know because it's going to affect, kinda, sorta, how you watch college football. That's coming up next. So the Mountain West has reached a streaming component to its television broadcasts. According to Brett McMurphy, tweeting out, TNT Sports and Mountain West reach multi-year agreement for a full slate of live college football games to air exclusively on TruTV and Max beginning this season. So the reason I bring this up on today's show is because if you listen to or watch this show, you're a college football fan. And something that continues to encroach upon us as college football fans is the ever-looming presence of streaming. And I don't think this is going in a downward direction. I think this is going in an upward direction when you're talking about how prevalent streaming is going to be to consume college football. When you've already had an NFL playoff game on Peacock and the success that had, streamers are going to look at those sorts of instances and say, why aren't we in there? Apple TV's got the MLS media rights, and they were in on the Pac-12 offered a deal, and they have got Major League Baseball contracts and whatnot. This is just another instance where streaming services are going to be a part of it. So the interesting component as well, because one reaction that I think people would naturally have to this is, wait a minute, I thought streaming was horrible. I thought you couldn't have games that are only on streaming services because the exposure is bad. The exposure is still clearly a major factor, because when you think back to what that Pac-12 TV deal offer was from Apple, it was going to be most of the games on Apple. Maybe they'd sublet or sublease a couple games out to television networks and such, but the money could have been worked up from the initial $23 million offer, but it was the exposure that was really a problem for schools like Oregon and Washington, so they went over the Big Ten. If you notice in this particular arrangement, TNT or Turner, which broadcasts March Madness, that's the only other time that I watch TruTV. I'm sure it's the only other time many of you watch TruTV as well. They have games on there in addition to putting some on Max. Now, what I'm really curious to see anytime these streaming arrangements come about is who are they putting on the streaming platform? Is it a throwaway game, or are they trying to draw people over? Because for anyone who looks at, the ever-evolving landscape and how do I watch my teams and what do I need to watch all the college football games that I want to see, that's what I'm most curious about, and why the NFL putting a playoff game exclusively on Peacock was such a huge deal, and it was a big success. And last year, NBC had the rights to Michigan State hosting Washington. Well, normally that'd be a more high-profile game than it ended up being because Michigan State didn't have a great season. But you, of course, had a team playing that went on to play for a national championship, and that was on a streaming-only service. And for anyone who's frustrated about this or doesn't care for it, I get it. I just think this is so completely inevitable. Everything has moved over to that platform. All the entertainment that we consume as a society is over there in the streaming world. Somehow, some way. Sports, they have just scratched the surface. They've barely even done that. They've really just tapped the glass for what streaming can be as it pertains to our live sports coverage. I don't think cable TV is going anywhere, but the president of ESPN has spoken publicly about how within the next several years, like 2 to 3 from when I'm recording the show, heck, it might be 1 or 2 when I'm recording the show, because I think I was referring to that article last year. ESPN is considering, or has considered, has discussed, or he could foresee them being an exclusively direct-to-consumer product, or just a streaming service. That's a pretty wild concept for the worldwide leader in sports. That's where everything is going. Now, one of the reasons that I don't push back on this or get annoyed by it as much is because of something that I have noticed in the streaming world. I, like many of you, have a bevy of streaming services, and it can be frustrating to say, well, like, where are my favorite shows? Well, I want to watch this, or I want to rewatch that. Oh, I don't have that service. Do I really want to rewatch it? Something that's happening right now that I think is going to encourage rather than discourage sports from moving over to streaming services bundling. Bundling is great. I am a big fan. I have got the Hulu, ESPN Plus, Disney Plus bundle. It's fantastic. There are other bundles that you can get. Like, everything kind of spread out. The market came with the streaming, and it was all about, hey, we're all going to have our own individual streaming service. You got to have it, right? Disney's got theirs, Hulu's got theirs, and Netflix is the king. Well, how can we chip away? Well, NBC's got Peacock, and like all this stuff started coming at it. And it was kind of, sensory overload for a lot of consumers. And what happened was there were too many different services. And I think consumers kind of felt that frustration of, I'm not paying for all these different services just so I can watch this one show. And so now you see companies coming together, and you can pay for that ESPN Plus, Hulu, Disney bundle. And there are several other bundles that are available out there. The TV media rights space is in a state of flux at the moment. I don't think you've seen the biggest changes take place, though, as it pertains to how you watch sports. I think those changes are still going to arrive, because anytime you have a major conference, I know the Mountain West is not a power conference. It's still a conference that I talk about on this show and that many of you watch. And I know I have some people in the audience out there that are fans of Mountain West teams. Having to watch your team on a streaming service is a rather notable development. That is a stark change from what it would have been 10 to 15 years ago. The Pac-12 network was not a streaming service. The problem with it was only available to certain cable subscribers because they weren't on DirecTV. That's why the viewership on it was not as strong as it should have been, and helped contribute to the downfall of the league, though it was a revolutionary concept at the time. That was outthinking the room and moving in a way that you were trying to kind of outsmart the room and come up with this brand new idea that was good in theory but bad in execution for the reason that I just highlighted. This notion, though, of putting games on streaming services, I think helps to ensure the financial stability of those services. Because when a show moves, like shows move all the time, Parks and Rec once upon a time was on Netflix. I'm pretty sure it's on Peacock now. When that sort of move happens, my incentive, because I love Parks and Rec, and I'm sorry, but I think it's better in The Office, my incentive to have Netflix lessens. So Netflix has to have something to keep my attention. If you are a streaming service and you have live sports, you're tapping into a whole new audience to where they're not going to be on the fence, because there are only a certain number of times per year where we can watch our teams play football. That is always going to be something that captivates people's attention. Television viewership has continued to go up, and they're just going to redirect where our eyeballs are. And personally, I'm okay with that because of the consolidation that's happening. If everything were still really scattered and it was very piecemeal and we weren't seeing these moves to make it a lot easier, where it like almost feels like it's a return to basic cable, like kind of, in that you're purchasing a package so that you have all of them. I mean, YouTube TV is a fantastic product that gives you access to all sorts of stuff like this, but can you get Max on YouTube TV? I actually think I'm not sure. Because that's not how I am able to watch Max. So that's what the Mountain West did that I think all college football fans should be aware of, because the continued presence of streaming, we don't have, it's not at a point where anyone is willing to accept an all streaming deal. I mean, heck, you look at what Oregon State, Washington State did with their television rights for this upcoming season. They went to the CW. Why? Because there's more exposure over there. It wasn't where the most money was. If they had gone to Apple TV or Amazon, if they were interested, but probably Apple would have been the choice because of their, previous Pac-12 offer, and said, hey, will you give us, X many millions to have the games be on there? They could have gotten more money than what they got from the CW. That is a widely held consensus, but that wasn't their priority. And you notice the Mountain West is not saying, yeah, you can just put some games on Max. No, we also are going to sublease games to Turner that are on TruTV because it's on cable. So no one has made the jump yet. No one's gone 2 feet into the pond with the streaming, but somebody will. Eventually, I don't know when, I don't know who. Eventually, you will have a streamer with the rights to a conference or to a huge subset of a conference's games. This is a small part of it, but it's just another step forward in the evolution of how we consume college football. And since we talk about college football here on the show, I thought I might bring it up. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.